Good afternoon. Welcome to the biggest climate session at Davos, Averting a Climate Apocalypse. I'm Rebecca Blumenstein, Deputy Managing Editor of the New York Times. This has already been a momentous day, and this is a very critical discussion to have now. It's been a year of prominent headlines on climate. Our job at the Times is to show it, not just to write it. The Australian fires consumed an area larger than the size of the entire state of West Virginia, and smoke from the fires was seen even in Chile. There's been record heat, droughts, flooding. It has now been officially confirmed that the past decade was the hottest on record. 2020 is an absolutely pivotal year for our world's climate. Some are even calling it the year of truth. 5 years after the Paris Accord, governments need to reset their goals, and businesses are finally and quickly talking about setting goals. We're running out of time to limit warming to 1.5 degrees and to avoid 2 degrees. Scientists say we need to keep warming below 1.5 to avoid the very worst impacts on all of us, and the more we delay, the harder it becomes. We have top voices from across the world to discuss the urgency of the situation and next steps. But we are going to start with some words from Greta Thunberg, who made headlines around the world last year by saying here at Davos that our house is on fire. I am so honored to welcome her to the stage.
Sorry. 1 year ago, I came to Davos and told you that our house is on fire. I said I wanted you to panic. I've been warned that telling people to panic about the climate crisis is a very dangerous thing to do. But don't worry, it's fine. Trust me, I've done this before, and I can assure you it doesn't lead to anything. And for the record, when we children tell you to panic, we're not telling you to go on like before. We're not telling you to rely on technologies that don't even exist today at scale and that science says perhaps never will. We are not telling you to keep talking about reaching net zero emissions or carbon neutrality by cheating and fiddling around with numbers. We're not telling you to offset your emissions by just paying someone else to plant trees in places like Africa, while at the same time forests like the Amazon are being slaughtered at an infinitely higher rate. Planting trees is good, of course, but it's nowhere near enough of what is needed, and it cannot replace real mitigation and rewilding nature. And let's be clear, we don't need a low-carbon economy. We don't need to lower emissions. Our emissions have to stop if we are to have a chance to stay below the 1.5 degree target. And until we have the technologies that at scale can put our emissions to minus, then we must forget about net zero. We need real zero. Because distant net zero emission targets will mean absolutely nothing if we just continue to ignore the carbon dioxide budget that applies for today, not distant future dates. If high emissions continue like now, even for a few years, that remaining budget will soon be completely used up. The fact that the USA is leaving the Paris Accord seems to outrage and worry everyone, and it should. But the fact that we are all about to fail the commitments you signed up for in the Paris Agreement doesn't seem to bother the people in power even the least. Any plan or policy of yours that doesn't include radical emission cuts at the source starting today is completely insufficient for meeting the 1.5 or well below 2-degree commitments of the Paris Agreement. And again, this is not about right or left. We couldn't care less about your party politics. From a sustainability perspective, the right, the left, as well as the center have all failed. No political ideology or economic structure has been able to tackle the climate and environmental emergency and create a cohesive and sustainable world. Because that world, in case you haven't noticed, is currently on fire. You say children shouldn't worry. You say, just leave this to us. We will fix this. We promise we won't let you down. Don't be so pessimistic. And then, nothing. Silence. Or something worse than silence. Empty words and promises which give the impression that sufficient action is being taken. All the solutions are obviously not available within today's societies, nor do we have the time to wait for new technological solutions to become available to start drastically reducing our emissions. So of course, the transition isn't going to be easy. It will be hard, and unless we start facing this now, together with all cards on the table, we won't be able to solve this in time. In the days running up to the 50th anniversary of the World Economic Forum, I joined a group of climate activists demanding that you, the world's most powerful and influential business and political leaders, begin to take the action needed. We demand at this year's World Economic Forum participants from all companies, banks, institutions and governments immediately halt all investments in fossil fuel exploration and extraction, immediately end all fossil fuel subsidies, and immediately and completely divest from fossil fuels. We don't want these things done by 2050, 2030, or even 2021. We want this done now. It may seem like we are asking for a lot, and you will, of course, say that we are naive. But this is just the very minimum amount of effort that is needed to start the rapid sustainable transition. So either you do this, or you're going to have to explain to your children why you are giving up on the 1.5-degree target. Giving up without even trying. Well, I'm here to tell you that, unlike you, my generation will not give up without a fight. The facts are clear, but they are still too uncomfortable for you to address. You just leave it because you think it's too depressing and people will give up. But people will not give up. You are the ones who are giving up. Last week, I met with Polish coal miners who lost their jobs because their mine was closed. And even they had not given up. On the contrary, they seem to understand the fact that we need to change more than you do. I wonder, what will you tell your children was the reason to fail and leave them facing a climate chaos that you knowingly brought upon them? That it seemed so bad for the economy that we decided to resign the idea of securing future living conditions without even trying? Our house is still on fire. Your inaction is fueling the flames by the hour. And we are telling you to act as if you loved your children above all else. Thank you.
Thank you, Greta, for those stirring and provocative words and for your leadership on this issue. I am going to start by asking our panelists a number of questions. We also want to open it up to you by the end of the session. And if you could please join us at wef.ch/vote. We will also get you registered because we'd like to take a couple polling questions in the middle of the session as well. Majun, I'd like to start with you. China is by far the largest emitter on Earth. And what would your response be to Greta? What will it take for China to really emerge as a leader on this issue, even probably without the U.S.?
Yeah, I think I greatly salute Greta's efforts because it has helped to vastly increase the public awareness globally. I think the public must play a vital role, if we want to avert a climate crisis. And this is quite evident in China, during this economic development in China, just like in the West, our fossil fuel consumption have vastly increased. From the year 2000 to 2011, just 11 years, our coal consumption have been tripled, burning half of the world's coal. And the original projection is for that volume to be doubled before we peak by 2040. Thinking about this is not sustainable at all. But Chinese people, our citizens, made their voice heard, when Beijing and the surrounding regions suffered from long stretch of smoggy days. Demanding for clean air, millions of citizens made on social media. And then the government responded by started monitoring and disclose PM 2.5 and then roll out a national clean air action plan. And I'm happy to report, through all this public-private partnership, during the past 7 years, Beijing's PM 2.5, the fine particles concentration, have dropped from 90 micrograms to 42 last year. So more blue skies. And during the process, the toughest issues of coal, China's coal consumption increase have been brought to an abrupt stop. Last 7 years, not much increase at all, stagnated. But that's not enough. Our mission have not been accomplished. We're still burning half of the world's coal, and we need to do more. But now, at this moment, we're facing the economic downturn locally, and globally, we're facing the trade war and also the withdrawal by the U.S. government from the Paris Agreement. All these are not helpful. So we need to find innovative solutions which tap into the market power, which can balance growth and protection. But all this need people to join the efforts. So with that, I truly salute the efforts to raise public awareness.
Oliver, you head Allianz, one of the world's largest insurers, and in September, along with the United Nations, launched a net zero alliance, which is basically encouraging managers and some of the biggest funds to reduce to be carbon neutral by 2050. And it feels, to Greta's point, why does it take so long? 2050 is 50 years from now.
Yeah, it's a very good. It's not 50 years from now, but only 30, thankfully. But it's still too long. So I fully share the outrage. I have a 19-year-old daughter who is asking me the same question every day. We heard part of the answer just now, but I want to be a little bit more optimistic. We have to be between outrage and optimism. I cannot get out every morning and just be outraged. I have to run a large institution. That's the largest institutional investor in Europe, probably. And we have to do something. So we're trying to connect the optimism and the outrage by doing stuff practically. And financial markets have been very weak in supporting, and investors very weak in supporting the transition. So I was personally in Paris 5 years ago, and I have to admit that I think we had much higher ambitions than what has been achieved. But I would like to point out a simple thing. It's the first time that business is leading and governments are behind. In the past, it was always governments demanding business to change business models, and then we had to adapt. Today, unfortunately, I believe that governments are behind the curve. Behind the curve, I can only speak for my home country. We always talk about the plans when we would get out of coal, but we're discussing dates, we're not discussing action. And what we are trying to do is put real action behind it. Now, you can debate the 250, but the reality is we started with $2.4 trillion committed to go net zero. We had nothing before. Probably by the end of the week, we will have more than doubled it. And once we're on the track we can talk about acceleration. But all of this, sorry to say, we need to move from outrage also to science. We need to do practical things to say, how do we actually address it? But I also will say, without proper support of the governments, particularly in the United States, in China and India, which is also planning to massively increase coal emissions, it will be futile. So we're going to do our job. We're going to exert the pressure that we can, and we work every day to make it faster. But there's a limit to what you can do.
So just to repeat that, you're trying to get a doubling of the commitments this week at Davos by meeting with various investors around the world.
And the key constituents group, and you can all help, is the sovereign wealth funds. The most amazing thing I found out over the last year, that we can convince very strong asset owners, CalPERS and others that have led the way in the United States, Pension Denmark and Scandinavia is always with us, our colleagues from AXA and others, we are committed. The most amazing thing is that the sovereign wealth funds, often by countries that have huge carbon issues, have not yet signed up. So we need to make sure, the Norwegians need to sign up that make all their money with fossil, that we need to get the Japanese involved. By the way, Chinese government institution, their pension money can be invested, so we could mobilize trillions and trillions more into the right direction. And then I'm very happy to talk about acceleration. But first, they need to commit, and then we speed up.
Hindu, you come from Chad, which is firsthand experiencing the impact of climate change, and you also serve on the board for the Tropical First Alliance. Can you talk about climate change and how it's affecting the people in Chad, and really the enthusiasm and willingness for them to play a very big role in what needs to happen?
Sure. Starting just by what Greta said, our house is burning. She said at the beginning and at the end. So for an indigenous peoples, when they say the forest is burning, it's not just like a language of expressions. It's our real home that's burning. Because indigenous peoples from all over the world, it can be from Chad, from Amazon, or from Indonesia, we are depending from these forests, who is our food, our medicine, who is our pharmacy, our educations. So for indigenous peoples in Chad, and especially my community who are pastoralists, cattle herders, is still nomadic. We are not depending from the end of the months. We are depending from the rainfall. And the climate impact, it's in our environment, in our social life. Our environment, when the rain become much and much shorter, with a heavy rain who can flood all our crops, or with a drought who can follow and dry up all our food. So that leads to the community to fight among themselves just to get the access of these resources that's shrinking. This is today. This is our reality. When forest is burning in Australia, in Amazon, it's forest that disappearing. But in my region, in Sahel, it's people that dying because of the climate change, losing them life, who do not think about the future. And that's also when people talk about 2050, for me, I'm like, really, seriously? By 2050, there's no solution for this planet. We need it now. So when the fight, you hear about the migrations, who become more and more. They migrate just to get to get access to the resources. And that's also what's happening the last months in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Nigeria, and going on and on. The people who live in harmony among themselves, between pastoralists and farmers, now they are fighting. So the nature who protect us become an enemy for the peoples. That's how we are experiencing it every day. And that changed the social life of man and women together. And we get more the impact is severe. So the action, I think it needs to happen now. And that's also why the Company Act is good. Chinese acting is good. But are we acting now? Are we acting for the real peoples? If we are doing it, yes. So don't talk about zero net by 2050. Talk about acceleration today. Change your policies. Change your business. Because for us, we are already getting mitigated and adapt. Let me tell you why very shortly. Because indigenous peoples around all the world, we have the wisdom. We are the most impacted, but we understand this nature. We develop the knowledge, we get adapt, and we know how to restore those forests who are burning. And look at the news in Guardian where they are saying the indigenous peoples of Australia, the 2 old women protecting them land because they know how to keep the fire away. It's the case of all indigenous peoples. A grandmother from Pacific, she knows where to get the crabs after the hurricane to feed her family. As my uncle and auntie's cattle, when they move, they know how to restore the ecosystem. So business need us because we are the future. We are the solution as indigenous peoples. So you need to listen from us, learn from us, and get your business sustainable. You cannot kill your partners because for us, the nature is our partners, we protect it. And for you, you need to protect your business and listen to us. We help you to do that.
Right. Rajiv, you're the president of the Rockefeller Foundation and also worked in the Obama administration where you were known for working with both Democrats and Republicans. Is there any hope for climate not being a partisan issue? As Greta said, she doesn't really care about politics, but that's usually how it plays out.
I think there absolutely is. I'm so glad that Hindu just gave us that passionate description of how climate change affects people and lives today, right now, not in the future, not only in the future. And I think that's perhaps the key to getting out of a political debate about climate change and getting to practical solutions. I've had the experience of walking on farms in Ethiopia with famous climate deniers from the United States Congress. And when they talk to farmers who are growing food to feed their family, barely getting by, and they recall the past famines in Ethiopia and what that was like, and they hear these farmers say, every year it gets hotter, it gets drier, rainfall becomes more erratic, and we face a longer period of food insecurity on a regular and annual basis. You can't argue with that, and that's not about a debate. That's something that is the felt experience of hundreds of millions of people. And in fact, climate change today bears its brunt mostly on the bottom 2 billion people on the planet. And so our commitment to Paris, our commitment to be serious and urgent in taking actions to meet those targets is not just about protecting the future, it is also about protecting today people who rely on climate, environment, and those natural resources to survive and to thrive. At the Rockefeller Foundation, we support 15 million farmers in Africa with improved technology and financing, and we see every day practical solutions that should be free from political debate. We know that it's not future technologies, they're current crops and access to fertilizer and access to services that can help farmers move their communities out of food insecurity. We just, a few months ago, launched a $1 billion joint venture with Tata Power in India to bring renewable solar microgrid energy to communities that, frankly, the government says they're connected to electricity, but they're not. They get a few hours a day, and they can't grow their communities that way. We now, with solar technology and improved battery and storage solutions, can provide power at a lower cost, fully loaded, than any coal plant connected to a grid, connected to extension into those rural communities. It's a fallacy to believe that solving climate change has to trade off with the living standards and improved living aspirations of the world's 2 billion poorest people. And I think in that space, we ought to be able to find really practical bipartisan solutions that can solve both challenges, climate and poverty.
But can I challenge that a bit? I know backstage we were talking, is it a fallacy to expect that people who don't have electricity yet are going to be able to not rely on fossil fuels? Is there like a little bit of a reality check that we need in terms of how we help those people?
Yeah, I think those who have must carry their responsibility to those who have not. taking China as an example, you put it quite correct that we're by far the largest emitter in the world. This is a result of China being the factory of the world. Increasingly, we're manufacturing to meet our rising demand, but in the meantime, we're still manufacturing for many parts of the world. And all those exports carries a lot of embedded carbon and pollution. And 2007, we launched the Green Choice Initiative when we map out the factory's performance in China and found many of them are major suppliers to those global brands' day-to-day consumption. And during the past 10 years, many of them started responding, and they have started motivating thousands upon thousands to change behavior. Having said that, there are many businesses which are not doing that. We're tracking 439 brands, and among them, 300 are not really want to even take a look at those violation records. We have 1.6 million records of violations compiled in our database. But if they compare the list, they can easily identify the problem. But many businesses would not take a look at that. And more recently, the green finance policy in China have enabled, we respond to that and develop a dynamic environmental credit rating system. And 6 million factories can give dynamic ratings. And there are so many who claim that they want to go ESG investment. Many are making heavy investment in China. We checked some of the portfolio. They're not all clean. There are all this data available. I mean, are you really doing that? I mean, are all this
So
ESG
there's a press
investors?
release saying they're ESG
Yes,
and they're doing something completely different.
many of them are not factoring in the so-called scope 3 carbon emission, meaning the supply chain. Supply chain usually account for 60, 70, sometimes 80% of the total carbon emission. If we don't integrate that into the action, if we don't distribute that to factory of the world like China, and of course now to many other developing countries, then Paris Agreement, we won't be able to achieve that.
So just keeping your global headquarters eco-friendly does not do it.
Changing the light bulb or reduce some business traveling, that's not enough, because by far the largest emission is during the manufacturing process, and those dirty work, those heavy duties still being carried by China now, and some other countries going to take it over. But this time we want to stop the migration of all this pollution. With all these new technologies available, China have done so much monitoring, install automatic monitoring on tens of thousands of major emitters. Now every hour, if you check our mobile app called the Blue Map, you can pull out thousands upon thousands of major factories' hourly disclosure data. We visualize by helping people to see whether they're in red or in blue. And there are major brands like Apple, like Dell, like Levi's, Adidas, H&M, the Target, Gap, they started tapping into that. But there are so many more which turn a blind eye because, So I would hope that the people, especially the younger generation, with all this enthusiasm, to pay more attention to the business, actual business action, rather than their, just press release.
Oliver, why is it so hard to reduce this fossil fuels and to get business to really comply?
We've just heard it. We have competing objectives, right? People want to have livelihoods. They want to grow. They come from very low living standards. And while we see that in China and other peoples of India, people says, I want electricity and I don't care whether it's coming from coal. And the pressures, but there's all excuses. I want to pick up on what we've just heard. The financial markets have to play a much bigger role, particularly banks also, in lending and others, not to give money to supply chains that do not listen. So what we really need is transparency, who's doing the right thing, rather than greenwashing. And it's very important that policymakers now make a decision that says, we want to understand what happens in your value chains in business. We are doing it individually. We're doing it with the Asset Owner Alliance. We're asking the businesses, but it's this 10 out of hundreds of trillions. So we need to make this change at scale. So I wish we get the support, not just this week, but others, to really increase it by 50-fold and not take 30 years to do it, but over the next 2 years. Because if there's no funding for the supply chains, there is no business model that can continue to pollute the world.
Should companies be required to disclose their carbon emissions? They're not now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But we have many other things. For example, in Germany, we are taxing energy consumption. We are not taxing carbon footprint. So there's zero incentive to move out of fossils. So pretty please, for all the warriors, let's do some practical things that we can do. And even if reforestation was just criticized, in many, many countries, we are giving tax incentives for exactly the wrong type of forest to be built, not the ones that are sustainable for drought or for fire and others. We're actually fast-growing growth. So there's so many things that we can do tomorrow, but it has to be done.
Hindu, President Trump just announced a pledge to build 1 trillion trees, I believe, in a reforestation initiative. Is that going to help? And could you talk about broadly the role that the natural world can play in reducing climate?
Okay, well, I will come back to this one.
Okay.
But just I want to react in, we are having two separate words here. When we talk about people want the electricity, I'm like, seriously? People who didn't get food for themselves, who can eat 3 meals a day, are they going to think about having electricity that's going to add the bill for themselves? So I think we need to talk about this inequality between what is technology, what is development, what is the need of the peoples, before to talk about how we can tackle climate change on energy or not. So developed countries need to shift and right now from the dirty energy, from coal or whatever, to the clean energy, but not for developing countries, because developing countries have the priority to eat first and then focus to the energy. Coming back to your questions. 3 trillions. Trees. When we talk about trees, I think most of the bigger power think planting a tree is the solution to the climate change. That's it. But planting trees, yes, we need to plant them. But how about keeping those who exist, the ecosystem who exists already? How about restore it? How about protect it? We can't give the excuse by planting 3 trillion trees and cutting those who can make a paper, who can make whatever that they want and make more money to them. That's the questions. So planting the trees is a second phase of the business. And we know how to do this restoration. Indigenous peoples in Amazon, when you go to them land, is the most diverse ecosystem. It's better than a national park because the government can't protect the national park from the fire or from the deforestation or from the illegal mining. But indigenous peoples can protect them land. That's why the ecosystem is more diverse there. It's the same in the Congo Basin because Chad, of course, is desert country, but it's part also of the Congo Basin. That's how we are protecting it. So we have the knowledge to do it. Let me give you one example on how we are restoring it. Like my grandmother is the best technology ever. Because she can predict the weather without having a cell phone or internet. She can predict the weather by observing the wind direction, by observing the birds' migration, by observing the tree flowers. She can tell her peoples from where they have to go to get water and pastures. So this technology to restoring her ecosystem can protect her peoples. And that's how we are getting protect. Even we are the most impacted, but we is still in our feet. And we are going to be in our feet for far. So let us restore this ecosystem and join all together, yes, to plant the trees after. Let me give you another example on trees.
Quickly.
Just a very short.
Okay.
The green world in Sahel. We say Sahel is a big land of desertification. But if community come together and each one of them take the responsibility of restoring his own land, that's the best way of planting trees. But not throwing millions of them, but giving the people's responsibility to make them themselves because they know it is them survival. So how I'm seeing this tree planting can be successful.
Rajiv, how do you square this conflict between the developed world and the developing world and the role that each needs to play? You have big investments in Africa and in India.
Well, and when I was in the Obama administration, was part of both the Paris Agreement and also the Sustainable Development Goals saying that we can achieve zero poverty by 2030. And both are in fact achievable and both can happen together. And it's not that difficult to figure out how. First, the 20 largest countries in terms of emissions are absolutely where efforts to get to zero emissions should start. And that is hard to imagine that being successful without government policy participation from China, the United States, and India. And right now, I'd say all three are going the wrong way. And even though China has done some things that are quite appropriate and notable, they're still financing 150 gigawatts of new coal plants in China, and much of it is actually in other countries around the world. The low-cost state-supported financing is in Kenya, it's in Guinea, it's in India, it's in Colombia. So I think it's important to recognize that this is a global issue, and the top 20 countries that emit have to have the politics and policies that say we're serious about getting to reduction. And with all due respect to corporations, it's very hard to see corporations using voluntary action to solve this problem. Second, I actually do think we have to refocus on the living standards and aspirations of the world's bottom 2 billion. And it is possible now to provide renewable-based energy to meet the growth needs of that population. And even recent World Bank studies from last year are already out of date in terms of their own assessment of where the lowest cost electrification strategy is from renewables. And I'm confident this year, in our one project in India, we'll be providing power based on solar mini grids to communities that have never had access to electricity at 15 cents a kilowatt hour. At that price, it beats every other alternative. And I have met women who have sewing machines and say, you know, I was finally able to get a electric sewing machine, double, triple my income, send my kids to school. A gentleman who works on a farm that's able to buy a rice huller and improve their post-harvest processing. Those are the kinds of things that will create employment, growth, and opportunity for the world's bottom 2 billion. And if we do not take their aspirations seriously as part of this effort, we're failing the other big challenge of our moment, which is the deep inequality that threatens the politics, that threatens us from being able to do things on climate that matter. And finally, I would just say, I do think there's a tremendous amount of space to move from divestment to investment. Rockefeller and a bunch of other foundations have moved away from fossil fuels in their direct investments. But even more important than that, having incentives to create investments so we have the trillions of dollars to create the technologies and the solutions that are necessary. It's not the only solution, but it has to be part of the picture, and we're proud to be associated with a number of those enterprises.
I want to ask all of you some of your opinions. We're going to cue to a question over who has the biggest responsibility for reducing emissions? Is it government? Is it the business community? Or citizens? If you could
It's hard to do.
enter your responses. We're not seeing much for citizens here, which is interesting. Okay. That's fascinating. And if we could, so government seems to be in the pole position here, as many on the panel have said, of needing to play a bigger leadership role. Can we cue to one more question? How concerned are you that 2020 will pass and we haven't made the progress that we need? Somewhat concerned, alarmed, status quo is fine, not at all concerned. Wow. Okay. Well, Greta, you are getting through, that's for sure. We have a lot of questions that have come in, and our time is rapidly disappearing here. So Oliver, there's an interesting question about nuclear power here, and I think to all the panelists, Germany took a step back in nuclear power, obviously with the Fukushima accident. What role does nuclear power play moving forward in terms of reducing climate warming?
I'm not an expert on technology, so to say that up front. And unfortunately, a lot of these things are discussed without facts. So, by the way, one of the things that we're doing with Net Zero is to have what we call the science-based target initiatives driven by the United Nations. So we need the facts. There are many ways to bring nuclear into the picture with more modern technology, so we wouldn't exclude that. I would like to pick up one point that he has. The commercialization of new sources, sustainable sources of energy has happened much faster than we could all imagine. So not just divestment of fossil fuel, new fossil fuel, but putting a lot more assets behind new technologies and their scaling. Unfortunately, we have many of these examples, but we're not scaling fast enough. So where are the proper incentives? How do we scale that? So what I'm trying to pick up from Greta is, it is taking too long because we're having too many anecdotes, too many nice stories, and too little systematic planning and execution. We need to move from words to action.
Majun, is there any way, I mean, the government of China obviously is very powerful. Your approach is to activate the private sector largely. Is that letting the government off the hook?
Yeah, the government must play its role for sure. You know, the whole reason that we as an NGO can compile so much data is because the Chinese government, in response to the public demand for data, you know, started rolling out all this monitoring and data disclosure. And we also changed the legislation, making our supervision much tougher. So. But I do think that, contrary to what many people would think, you know, in China, if the government try to do something, it can do something. You know, there's also limit there. So the government also need people. You know, need the public, need to send the clear message, and also the government also need the business to join the efforts, especially now. And now there's such a vast development of IT technology. I would definitely agree with Oliver. You know, I just recently met with our solar panel manufacturer. You know, during the past 10 years, there's a 90% drop of the cost, and they said they're on their way for another 90% drop. And we have the first solar panel, power plant, which can generate power electricity cheaper than the coal power plant. So I think all these are major opportunities, but we need motivation. We need incentive for this to be tapped. You know, all this technology is available. Nuclear, pushing the whole cost to the future generations, with all this spent fuel, disposal. So I do think that now, if we all, share this view that the house is, our house is burning, our whole planet home is in danger, then we need to, come together to make our voice heard, to motivate, as citizens, as consumers, you can do so much, because the whole business would respond to that if you choose that you care. Changing your day-to-day behavior is important. But if we can play our role more smartly, tapping into all this new...
Making the data more transparent.
No technology, then we can scale up our efforts and achieve our target in a practical and much sooner way.
In meeting Greta's challenge, I'd like to ask all of you, what is the single thing, if you were talking to a peer about today's panel, what is the single thing that you would recommend that we should do to avert a climate apocalypse? Anyone like to start?
I can go. I think the single thing that I want, the emergency is now. It's not tomorrow. So the action needs to be now. Because what are we waiting for? Forest burning, food becoming difficult, but people dying. Nothing more for me than seeing the community that dying, who do not have future for tomorrow, then who cannot think about the next 50 coming years. So the action have to happen now, and Davos is a big opportunity, 50 years, so it's now time to open all our mind, our eyes, from business to the big politician leaders who are here, to take a radical step further, shift the economy to the clean one, and take the decisions to change all and every system to the sustainable one, to save them peoples, to save themselves, indigenous people saving ourselves with our knowledge. And it's the time to listen for us. Give us our place. We can talk and we know how to do it. We know how to protect it. So lie on our back, don't be in our face, and give us the way to act all together right now.
Yeah, I want to say, of course, it sounds like advertising, but yeah, you're welcome to download the Blue Map app, and because you can see the words is, sometimes our home is on fire. You know, we track the global kind of air quality, and most of the time, you know, China, India, we're suffering from very severe air quality problem. But more recently, we started seeing in the Southeast Asia, Borneo, you know, sometimes all this burning, and Amazon, Australia. It's hard to imagine. San Francisco, you know, the LA, you know, those California, there's bushfire. So we can see it's on fire. But in the meantime, you can see 3 million factories located on the digital map, color coding according to their level of performance. I challenge the business to look into that, because we are tracking hundreds of brands also on the app. You know, you can see as consumers or business leaders how they perform. I hope we can come together based on the data transparency.
Very tough. Very tough. I don't want to say something that sounds great, but it's not doable. But I'm getting out. At the beginning of the week, we said, you know, we'll be successful if we do 2x. We have to think as a startup and not like a 130-year-old company, which we are. We have to do 10x in terms of getting the commitments. And we'll try to do it as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. So not just doubling, 10 times what you started with. And how long?
We don't have 30 years. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Rajiv.
I think my big observation is that this takes all of us. And you had that chart that said it's 50-some% government and the rest private sector. At the end of the day, we need governments to set policies, make agreements, and live up to those commitments. And I agree with Greta's observation that we're nowhere near meeting those Paris commitments. As so many people felt they were insufficient as they were, and we're going to roll into Glasgow this year, at the end of this year, and I think people will see that we're just not on a path where people are living up to the commitments that were made just a few years ago. So governments have to offer real leadership. I applaud Alain's, and I think the private sector and companies have to take this on as well. But I also think citizens matter, and citizen activists that are, you know, putting this issue on the map and making it the cause of our time, citizen scientists who are inventing new solutions, citizen activists who are working with indigenous populations. It's so critical that we all think of this as something each of us has to do, including changing the way we eat, changing the way we buy products, changing the way we live our lives, so that we can be part of the solution.
I'd like you all to join me in thanking Greta and our panelists for a fascinating discussion.